before dawn, just to bring you
Top of the morning from beautiful downtown Boston.
Science and Biological Sciences from Colorado State University. She's got a Master of Science in Microbial Ecology from Utah State and a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Utah State. And I think she'll tell us why she went to Utah State here, right? Coming up. She was selected by NASA in 1980 in the 9th group of astronauts. She's a veteran of 2 space shuttle missions. STS-61B, it was aboard Space Shuttle Atlantis back in 1985. On that mission, they deployed 3 satellites and did 2 spacewalks. And she was also a crew member on STS-30, which was also on board Space Shuttle Atlantis in 1989. And on that mission, they deployed the Magellan spacecraft that orbited Venus and took some great images of the planet. She spent a total of 11 days in space, 172 orbits of the Earth, and she's traveled 4 million miles and another 100 miles getting here from Annapolis today. She worked at the Goddard Space Flight Center and then at NASA headquarters as Associate Administrator. And let me tell you that only 56 women have flown in space in the last 51 years of the space program. And Mary is the 8th American woman to fly in space, and she's the 10th woman overall to fly in space, which is pretty amazing. So I'm really honored. Give her a round of applause. I would say, Mary, you're in the top 10.
Just made it.
So please join me in welcoming a national hero, a good friend, and a really great person, Dr. Mary Cleave. Can you guys hear this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So it's really nice to be here today. I appreciate it. Loretto and I drove up from around Annapolis, and it's always nice to come up into Baltimore. Loretta's taping this today because she's going to use it for a local TV program called Top of the Morning. So, and we met each other at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center where she was helping us because we were putting together an exhibit for to get girls interested in math and science. And that exhibit is down at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center down in downtown Baltimore, and it's going to be there for the rest of the year. So if you want to stop by and take a look at it, it'll show you all the different things that women in Maryland do in math and science, engineering, and technology. And so you may be interested in seeing the Maryland heritage in that area. There are a lot of women that are very active. We're going to do sort of a 2-part thing. One's on studying the Earth from space, and a lot of that work we do here at Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. And we use a lot of unmanned vehicles for that because you have to, in order to study the Earth, it's good to have data over and over and over again. And so that's sort of a robotic mission. When you want to do things over and over and over again, that's what we use robots for. And then when you want to do things that are very involved a few times, then that's what people are better for. So then my second space flight will show you how we deployed Magellan that went to Venus off the space shuttle. Okay? Any questions? All right. So I'm glad to see so many people here today on a Saturday morning. I had a little trouble getting around myself. It's always nice to talk to you about how lucky I am. I've had a great career. Don asked me to talk to you about how I got into the astronaut program, just in case any of you think you want that kind of job, because it's really a lot of fun. I sort of never, when I was your age, I didn't really think about being an astronaut, because there were astronauts. I'm not that old, but they were all guys. They were all test pilots. They all had crew cuts. And girls couldn't even fly airplanes. I mean, if you wanted to go into commercial aviation, you were called a stewardess, and that's what did. And so that's what I wanted to do. I went to undergraduate school. I left Long Island and went to undergraduate school at Colorado State University because I like to ski. And it was a great place to go to school. I had a marvelous time. I ended up working as a ski instructor. It was on a quarter system, so I could ski all winter and take a few classes. It was fabulous. And then when I graduated, I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, but there was a quota system and they wouldn't allow women. Only 2 women were allowed into the vet school at Colorado State. I was from New York. They told me I had to go back to Cornell, and Cornell wouldn't take me because I was a girl and I wanted to be a veterinarian. And back in those days, that was perfectly fine. It was before Title IX, and if a school didn't want to take you because you were a girl, or if they didn't want to take you because you were a boy, they could get away with that. But because of the Title IX laws, they can't do that anymore. So if things are improved for you, you can do whatever you want. Take advantage of it. Appreciate it. So I wanted to be an airline stewardess because I couldn't go to vet school. Well, I was 2 inches too short. You had to be 5'4" to be an airline stewardess at that point in order to put help with putting the bags up in the bins. So I was too short to do that, so I said, thank you very much, you're too short, we don't want you. That was in 1969. In 1979, I ended up moving down to Houston to become an astronaut. So a lot changed in those 10 years. Pretty breathtaking changes for us. So what I did in between, because I wasn't thinking about being an astronaut at that point, it wasn't even in my mind. I mean, here I was, I wanted a job in aviation, I was too short to be an airline stewardess, and that was the only job that was open to me, so I wasn't really considering being an astronaut. But I was gone to graduate school, was very interested in plants, so I got a master's degree in microbial ecology. I did want to be a tree doctor, but when I got to graduate school, they said the future of plants is in lower plants, so I became a microbial ecologist and was really enjoying that. Got a job in a lab. Before I went back to graduate school, I was going to get a PhD in some kind of, microbial ecology. Got a job in a lab, but it was an engineering lab, and they were paying me to identify algae for them. And I ended up working in that lab for 2 years. Really enjoyed working with the engineers. Never thought about being an engineer. Girls didn't do that. But when I went to go back to graduate school, I said, okay, I'm going back to graduate school, guys. You got to get yourself another staff ecologist. I'm going back to the ecology center and get a PhD. And they said, you don't want to do that. You don't want to be a scientist. You want to be an engineer. And I said, I don't want to be an engineer, because there's a lot of tension between the 2 groups. If you're studying engineering, you're trained to take all the data and make the best decision you have at that point on the data you have. If you're a scientist, however, you're trained to collect data until you can find the truth and then move the whole science forward based on all the information you've collected, and it better be right, okay? So you can imagine, because of those 2 cultural approaches to things, there's a little tension between the 2 groups. Because scientists think that engineers are sloppy because they just make these decisions, and sometimes they're wrong. Okay? And engineers think scientists are boring because they'll work on some little thing forever. Just some little thing forever. Okay? So those are the 2 cultural things. So they're both right. I mean, it just depends on what personality you have. There's no right personality or wrong personality. You just have to figure out which one you are. Well, the dean of the College of Engineering at Utah State took me in his office and he said, Mary, I've watched you work for 2 years. You're too impatient to be a scientist. And he was right. I'm a much better engineer than I was a scientist because I like to do lots of different things, okay? And I have a friend, Claire, who's a fabulous scientist. She's a ice scientist. She studies ice. And she works at Goddard, and she's a fabulous scientist, and she just loves getting a hold of a problem and working on it, working on it, working on it. And she's great at that. So she has the right personality for that, and I have the right personality to be an engineer because I like to do a whole bunch of different projects and move on to the next thing. Okay, so first, if you want to find the right job, you got to figure out what kind of person you are. So and keep an open mind, because just like me, you might not understand that, you have a better personality for a certain kind of job, and so sometimes teachers can really help you out. because they get a chance to look at them. And if you get some advice like that, just step back and listen to it, because they may just be right. Now, they may not be right, but they may be right, okay? So that's my little advice for you to start off the talk. So that's how I got here, because Eddie Joe, who's Dean of the College of, I should say Dean Middlebrooks, who's Dean of the College of Engineering at Utah State University, pulled me aside, convinced me to be an engineer. Now, just his words weren't enough. I went up to the Ecology Center. They offered me a job working research on cold desert soil crusts, cryptogrammic crusts. So I would have spent my entire PhD with my nose in the dirt in the cold desert of Utah. Great data though, because that's where we had to figure out how much carbon was being taken up by those desert crust systems all over the planet. So it was very important work to figure out our global climate cycle. However, you know, Dean Middlebrooks and the guys at the Water Lab offered me a project called Potential Impacts of Oil Shale Development on the Colorado River System. And there I'd be floating on the Colorado River for my, PhD research. Okay, what am I going to do? Do I want to put my nose in the dirt in the desert, or do I want to go float on a river? Okay, I'll be an engineer. And that's what I am. So, got my PhD. I was just, I was in the last year of my PhD. I was working at the Water Lab on my research, and one of the other engineers working at the Utah Water Research said to me, "Mary, did you see the ad in the Logan Post Office about NASA looking for scientists and engineers to go work in space?" And I said, "No." He said, "You need to go look at that. You're the only engineer working here who's nuts enough to want to do this job." And boy, was he right. I got down to the Logan Post Office. This was before the internet, so this is how the government announced stuff. They put ads up next to the 10 most wanted posters. So right there next to the 10 most wanted posters in the Logan Post Office was this poster for NASA saying they were looking for scientists and engineers to go work in space. I'm sure, Don, how did you find out? Did you see a poster?
I think I saw it in the newspaper.
In the newspaper, yeah. I was out in Logan. It was even beyond newspapers. So, but we call the local newspaper the Logan Liar, to give you an idea. I saw the ad. I started looking into it. Well, for me, the big important thing was I found out that if you were going to be an astronaut and got this job they were advertising, you had to fly 15 hours a month, stay current in a T-38 jet. Well, bingo. I had been trying to get into a high-performance jet. I started flying when I was 14, those little bug smashers, those little Cessnas. Soloed when I was 16, got my private license when I was 17. I was growing up in New York, so we couldn't drive till we were 18. So for a year, my mother used to have to drive me to the airport so I could fly people in an airplane. Things were a little backwards. So, but there was no way. I had tried on and off to get my job in aviation. Didn't work. Too short to be an airline stewardess. All of a sudden, here's the government. They want to hire me to fly in T-38s for 15 hours a month. I'm going, these guys, this is a job for me. This is my job. I wasn't even thinking about the space shuttle. I mean, that would have been nice. But for me, it was getting my rear end in a T-38 jet, So off I went down to Houston. I really worked at this. I mean, instead of going and getting a job with an engineering firm in California, like I was offered, I again talked to the, faculty at Utah State, the dean and Dean Adams, who was the guy that ran the water lab that I worked at, and said, I really want to do this. I really have to get in shape. Is there anything I could do? Could I go back and get my phycology job, and just identify algae for you so I have enough time to work out? And they gave me a postdoc. So I went on a postdoc at Utah State so I could get in shape. And so I was running up and down, I don't know, the Wellsville Mountains, where I was right behind my house, are the steepest mountains in the United States. Okay. So I'm running up to the top of the Wellsvilles and back down, trying to make sure I was in good shape, And this is at high altitude because you're up in the Rockies. Okay. So I get down to Houston to take my treadmill. And I've been training like that at altitude. And the guys gave me a standing ovation after I got off this treadmill. I just blew them away. So, because I've been training at altitude. Houston is like 2 feet above sea level. I got down there and I was burning. It was really good. So, I got a job. You know. It was wonderful. And I moved to Houston, Texas from Utah. It was very, very humid in Houston. But that's how I got into the astronaut work. So, it was really very serendipitous. It was a very, as you can tell, it took me a long time to tell you this story, a very convoluted path. But the important part of this story is life changes. As you go through life, things will change around you. You live in the context of a society, and you got to keep your eyes open and take advantage of all the opportunities that are available to you, and they can really change, and you got to be nimble. And you got to, you know, have a good broad basis for what you're studying. And then you can make these turns, and it's very interesting, okay? So that's how you end. Does that do it?
That's right.
Okay, thanks. So now we can start on the talk. Unless any of you want to be an astronaut, you got a question? No? Okay. We'll start on the talk. Oh, he does? You want to be an astronaut? What's your question?
What emotions did you feel when you were about to launch into space?
What emotions did I feel when I was about to launch into space? Well, on my first flight, I was a flight engineer. Okay, so, I mean, you're looking at somebody that started out as a private pilot in Cessnas and ended up being a flight engineer on the space shuttle, you know, and so I was a little nervous, you know, that I was going to screw up. I was very concentrated on my job. I was totally oblivious to what was going on. I was so focused on what I was doing, I barely felt the main engine's light, you know. And I was looking at the data and doing my job so much that by the time the main engines shut off, you know, 8 minutes and 10 seconds later, everybody's floating around and I'm going, we made it! Totally weird. So I had absolutely no emotions except don't screw up. That was it for me, okay? Okay, so these first slides are from the second part of my career. Because after I was in the astronaut office for a decade, like I told you, I have this predisposition to change. I mean, about every time, I'm on a decadal plan in my life, every 10 years I got to do something totally different. That's just the way it's ended up, okay? I don't get bored, I just want to think about something else. It's very good I wasn't a scientist, I would have been a lousy scientist. So, I ended up leaving Houston because I wanted to get back into the environmental business because, you know, you'll see from these pictures, when you're flying in low Earth orbit, the view from low Earth orbit of the Earth, you go around the Earth every hour and a half, you go across the United States in 7.5 minutes. So you get to see a lot of territory, and the Earth looks very fragile. So if you already have concerns about the environment like I did before I went to Houston, I spent 10 years working on a space shuttle, and all I wanted to do was get back into the environmental business and go to work. So I moved to Goddard, which is in Maryland, and it's in Greenbelt, and it's, at that point it was the home of more Earth scientists than any other place on the planet, and I think it still is. Okay, and it's the home of Earth science in NASA. Now they do it at other field centers like JPL, but in California, but Goddard is really the lead center for Earth science, and that's where they build the weather satellites and all that kind of stuff. So I moved up to Goddard. I got offered a job as a deputy project manager, and on a little spacecraft to measure all the plants on the planet every 48 hours. Well, it was supposed to be all the plants in the ocean. But we were able to modify the gain on the instrument and get all the plants on the planet, which was really, it was a great thing. I mean, we were really lucky we could do that. And so these are some slides from unmanned spacecraft to talk about the second part of my career first. So here you can see, I don't know if any of you know this planet, but this is Saturn. It's Saturn, a picture of Saturn from Cassini. Cassini is a spacecraft that we launched to study this planet. It's a robotic spacecraft. Right now, I mean, currently in the news you're reading about Enceladus, which is a moon that's out in one of these rings. And you see all this is water, we think is water vapor, all the stuff that's shining off the sides. And it's coming out of Enceladus, a big water volcano on Enceladus. Okay? So, now the reason you're going, well, you were going to talk about the view of the Earth from space, you know. And what is she showing us Saturn for? Because I'm not a planetary scientist. I am an earth scientist. Well, I'm an environmental engineer. But I'd like you to look right there. Okay? You see that little dot that sort of looks like a moon of Saturn? You got it? Let's see if this works. What you're seeing is Earth as seen through the rings of Saturn in a view that was taken by the Cassini spacecraft. This is because we wanted to get a picture of the rings of Saturn. So we drove Cassini out when it was on the far side, you know, because Sun's here, Earth's here, and then Saturn's out here. So Cassini was out on the outside. So we cranked it around to look back. So then that's the sun backlighting. You can see a little bit of the sun peeking out right there. And so that's why you can see the Earth through it, because you're looking back towards the sun, and we happen to be there. Okay? This is a view of CWIS data taken over time. It's called the pulse of the planet. This is what plants look like over different seasonal cycles. You can see the snow up there, the green of the plants. In the water, what you're seeing is if there is a lot of algae, it's red. If there's not a lot of algae or phytoplankton, then it gets bluer. And then if there's hardly anything at all, or if there's just a little bit, it's sort of pinkish. Okay? So there's a different color code for plants in the water and plants in the ocean. But when we run the carbon models, we add them all back up. And the thing about this spacecraft, which was called CWIS, which was built in this area, it was managed out of Goddard. The instrument was built in California. The spacecraft was built out of Dulles at Orbital Sciences Corporation. And it was launched out of California, out of Vandenberg. It is the first time we had a measure of all the plants on the planet, which was an incredibly powerful tool. We've been measuring this now ever since we launched in 1997. And we have other instruments up on orbit, and this is a continuing measurement that we... Now, you hear a lot of discussion. It's not just the Earth. When you're studying climate stuff, it's not just the Earth you have to study. And I'm going to have a lot of information on the sun. And this is what it looks like when you have a coronal mass ejection and it comes into the Earth. And you can see that we can study these big phenomenon using a lot of different spacecraft. This is what it looks like if you get to look at it up close. You can see from the very surface of the sun. So this is when they say we're having a solar storm. This is what's happening on the sun. See, there are these ribbons of material being ejected out from the front. It comes blasting through space and interferes with our planet. But we're protected by our magnetosphere, which is the big magnetic field that bounces that all off. So this is why we're safe sitting on the surface of the planet, and we're not going to get zapped with solar radiation. However, the guys that are up on the space station, when we have a big ejection like that, they have to go crawl into a certain part of the station where they have more protection, because they're not, although they are within some protection, because they're in low Earth orbit and not out in deep space, they still don't have the protection we have here. And just like if you're up high in a mountain, or if you're up in an airplane near the poles, or in the South Atlantic anomaly, where our magnetosphere dips down, you get a lot more radiation. This is what the aurora looked like when it impacts our surface of our planet. And this is what the solar cycle looks like. So this is over time, over a cycle of 11 years. You can see the dates running on the bottom, where it gets quieter now, around 85. Then up around 1990, the activity starts to pick up. You see what a difference it is between the different solar cycles? It's really a large difference. So if you're running electrical power systems, where you have to be concerned about interference with your transmission grids, or any kind of communications, you have to be very aware of what's going on. So, again, I want to finish this portion just giving you an idea of exactly how small we are in a sense, because this is coming in to the Earth on a little voyage through the universe, okay? So imagine you're on an interstellar spacecraft and you're heading home, okay? And you're going to go through various astronomical features out, you know, on your voyage back. And then all of a sudden you're going to see the sun, and you're going to go past their Saturn again. Here you are coming in to approach the Earth. Jupiter. Through the asteroid belt. Hope you don't get hit. There's Mars. The moon. And you made it, you're home. Okay? Cool. So that's where we live. And it's a very fragile place, and we really have to be careful taking care of it. Okay? Do you have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So you were joking about going to the asteroid belt. Do you realize you face for impact, or can you avoid things, or does it mean the shuttle when it landed pretty beat up? Did you just get anything?
Yeah, the question is about impacts in spacecraft, and that's a really big problem because it's a hypersonic impact. If you go to a place in Tennessee called Tullahoma, that's where the Air Force and NASA studies hypersonic impact. And you can have a little teeny thing, just a little teeny thing. And if you're going at hypersonic speeds and you impact, that little teeny thing will make a tiny little hole in the front of your ship, and it'll blow the whole back of it out. Okay? So you don't want to hit anything. Now, we do hit things in the shuttle. I'm an environmental engineer. We used to be called sanitary engineers in the old days. Okay? So when I got down to Houston, on the first shuttle flight, I got called into John Young's office, who was the head of the office, and he was the commander of STS-1, the first shuttle flight. Everybody was, oh, Mary's had called in the office, because this is a big deal, you know, working on stuff. He said to me, Cleave, the head didn't work. Fix it. Anybody know what a head is? It's a spaceship. I'll give you a hint. It's the bathroom. That's right. The bathroom didn't work on the first shuttle flight. And this may not seem like a big problem, just like getting hit with a little thing doesn't seem like a lot problem. But if you got a whole bunch of guys living in a compartment the size of a closet, if the can doesn't work, you're in trouble. So I got to fix the shuttle, and we did all sorts of research. And one of the things we found out was we were bringing back the shuttle and we were having tile damage. You said that the shuttle looks pretty beat up when it was landing. Well, one of the things that was beating it up that we figured out was we analyzed these little pock marks in the tile, which is very, very fragile. And those little pock marks had urine in them. You're going, how do we get human urine up in your low Earth orbit? Oh, we do wastewater dumps up on orbit. So we had to change the way we were doing wastewater dumps so we didn't beat up the tiles on the shuttle. So yes, you have to think about everything you're doing up here. Because it's, you know, if you don't really think it through, it's going to cause problems. And it's counterintuitive because you're up on orbit, so it's orbital mechanics. So if you dump facing the Earth down into a lower orbit, it's going to go faster than you. And it's going to get ahead of you, and you're going to end up going back through it if you burn into low, you know, the orbit. So, yeah. Not only do you have to think about everything you're doing, you got to think about it backwards. Because when you're in low Earth orbit, because of orbital mechanics, if you want to speed up, you have to hit the brakes. And if you want to slow down, you got to hit the accelerator. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. Yeah.
As an environmental scientist, do you have any thoughts on these proposals to sort of radically terraform using like spraying certain gases in the atmosphere or whatever? You know?
Yeah, the question is about my opinion of terraforming the Earth in order to ameliorate the environmental damage we're doing.
Right, the previous.
Yeah, and I want to tell you, the Earth is a very complex system. And we can't even manage uncomplex systems. I mean, you know, look at what happened in Japan after the earthquake. You know, they couldn't manage to keep, you know, a pretty simple little contained, you know, nuclear power plant together, you know. And, you know, it's too complex. I think that we are fooling ourselves if we think we can think this through and actually figure out what's happening. Because, you know, we can't even figure out what the weather's going to be like. Well, we're better off, you know, within 24 hours now, we're doing pretty well. But
You had a timeline of solar activity on one of your slides, and during a certain time period, I think around 1985 and 2005, it was like really, really low. What causes, like?
the question is about the solar cycle. There's a natural cycle to the sun. It's called a solar cycle, and there's solar minimum and solar maximum, and that's what you were seeing. It's actually a cycle that happens all the time.
And is it always every 10 years, or is it?
It's
around
10, 11 years.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's variations on the norm, but it's pretty dependable. Pretty dependable. Yes, ma'am.
You said every 10 years, it's time to do something else.
Yeah.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? My 10-year cycle? I'm retired now. I retired from the federal government. You know, I ended up my last 10 years in the federal government was working downtown Washington, D.C., and that after 10 years in Washington, D.C., I decided that was enough for me. I retreated to Annapolis to lick my wounds. And so I'm supposed to be retired, but I'm finding out I'm too busy to be retired. And right, like this week, coming up, to give you an example, a bunch of retired engineers I worked with at Goddard that work on little unmanned spacecraft like this. We put together a proposal to put into the National Science Foundation to build little nanosats. That's a partnership between University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which is out near Wallops, where we would be doing this work, and where there's a new engineering program which is just being started up at UMES. And I partnered them with Utah State. That's where I went to graduate school. And there's a really good space dynamics lab there, and we got atmospheric scientists, and we're putting a proposal. We should find out next week whether we get funded. And if we get funded, I'll be, you know, working on building nanosats with students, because that's fun. And these nanosats are really neat, because we can let students actually build them, because we launch them. The really expensive part about working in space is getting there. And when you launch a great big rocket, like one of those big ones with the big satellites on them, you can use up to 2,000 pounds in lead just to get the center of gravity on the rocket right. You got to get the center of gravity right. Well, what we do is we use these little nanosats instead to do that. And we wait out the rocket so we get a free ride, so we can afford to build the screens. So I think that's enough questions. I'm going to go ahead and show a movie from my next space flight, and then we'll be done. Okay?
That was one of the crew pictures we took that kind of said what everybody was going to do on the mission.
Being led out really by mission specialist Norm Thagard, Mark Lee, Mary Cleave, and the commander and pilot, Commander Dave Walker waving, and pilot Ron Graby waving. T-minus 15, 14, 13, and liftoff.
7 feet per second. Atlantic 2 miles downrange.
Brewster and Brian and Murray in the flight deck. They're preparing for the first of the 2 spacewalks. 3 of us, Murray, Woody and myself, dubbed ourselves the Ace Construction Company with the supporting crew of the rest of the crew, and we put up our advertisement after we'd completed the construction of the first access truss.
The arm flies wonderfully. It's just such a great tool. Real smooth and no surprises. Being able to interact with them, and they gave me some real good directions while we were up there.
Mary took most of these motion picture Earth views that we've got, and this is one way she did it.
we had a mid-deck experiment called a fluid experiment apparatus, which you can see here. My hands are inside of this. It's a little furnace. We were growing indium crystals. It was really an excellent mid-deck for us. We controlled it with our little experiment computer, which worked great, different floppy disks for each experimental run.
Here's Mary at the overhead windows. This is our primary vantage point for Earth observation photography.
Yeah, I sort of shared doing the food cooking duties. Whoever got hungry first seemed to be the person that would end up cooking. But it's actually a lot easier in 0G going up the stairs. In 1G you have to be careful and take the trays one at a time, these bags, before we unpack them. You can see it took up a lot of space down here. A lot of times at work I feel like I'm running around in circles, and so I tried actually running around in circles, and it worked up there, and it was a lot of fun.
Walker?
So I was all alone. I thought it was going to be really lousy. But you know that question you had about what the ride was like? Well, this time I didn't have anything to do unless we had to bail out, and then I had a lot to do. So I got to enjoy the ride. I asked Red Flash, the commander, if I could turn my mic off. I turned my mic off, and I just hooted and hollered all the way over. It was a great ride. I could feel us turn upside down and just ride. And it goes, and when the solid rock motors came off, I could feel the rockets taking them away from the shuttle. And then it was just this really good, steady push all the way up to MECO, or when the main engines cut off. It was great. I had a wonderful time. But when I got up on orbit and I had to go to work, I was afraid to undo my seatbelt because I felt like I was upside down. Of course, I floated as soon as I did, but my mind was set up to work on Earth, but it worked okay. So here we are up on orbit, getting the spaceship ready, because you have a spaceship, you ride it up to orbit, then you have to get it ready to work on orbit, and so you got to reconfigure all the 1,442 switches and circuit breakers up on the shuttle. Okay, so you have books that tell you how to do that, and you follow the books very carefully, and the guys on the ground follow you, and if you make a mistake, believe me, they'll let you know. Okay, so here we are. We're getting ready for the deploy, and here's Magellan. It's getting ready to go to Venus. It is a large spacecraft, but you see the solar arrays are very small. That's because Venus is closer to the sun, so you don't need big solar arrays. And that's why we can use these solar arrays, and this didn't have to have a nuclear power source, because Venus is closer to the sun, so it does very well just on the solar arrays. And this was not a surface rover. This was going into orbit, and it was going to study Venus from Venusian low Earth orbit. So you can see it separates from the shuttle very slowly. And that's because the springs just pushed it off. And we're just sitting there, taking the movies, recording it, and then checking the data and making sure it's okay. As soon as it's going to be okay, you arm it, and then what you want to do is move the shuttle away in case. See, what you're looking at the business end of the rocket right there. It's right in the overhead window. And you don't want that firing when you're anywhere near it, particularly not with it pointed towards you. So you hang around until you make sure it's going to be okay and fire. And then as soon as you pull away, and then you turn the shuttle around so the belly of the shuttle is towards the rocket, just as a safety maneuver. But you want to see that the solar array is deployed before you do that. So that's what we're waiting for. Here are the deployed solar arrays. See, we got onto the dark side now, so you're just seeing the spacecraft from reflected light from the sun. And there was Venus. They told us before we launched, we said, oh, we're going to be able to see Venus. They said, no, but we were able to catch it right before it set behind the planet. Here's the atmosphere of the Earth. That's all we got. There isn't very much of it. We got to take care of that, too. And then there's the tops of the clouds. And there's Venus setting back behind. So it was amazing. So we could look up and see the spacecraft, and look over and see Venus. It just, oh, well, that's going there. It was just amazing. So here we are, after that was all done, and that was the majority of what we had to do, because it was so heavy, we couldn't carry much else. But this is DMOS. I'm working a crystallography experiment. And it was, this is an indium crystal. I was trying to build one continuous indium crystal. You work crystallography in space because there's no gravity, so there's no convective mixing, so you can make huge crystals. Just huge, because there's nothing to break them up. So that's what I was trying to do, make one long indium crystal. And it worked pretty well. Here's an idea of the size of the crystal. There's Mark Lee's thumb. It was the first time we'd ever used a floppy disk in low Earth orbit, and it worked fine. I had a little laptop computer. These are sort of ancient compared to what we have now, but I had this little grid laptop computer. The guys, this is Mark Lee, he was a rookie. They were working pre-breathing experiments because we were doing a lot of experiments trying to figure out how we were going to build a space station. So here they are getting ready, suited up to do these pre-breathing experiments. That's Mark Lee here. And Mark was a Air Force pilot, and Norm was an F-4 pilot in the Marines in Vietnam, but he had gotten out of the Marines, went to medical school, so he was a doctor. So here they are getting ready to pre-breathe. Now, why do you pre-breathe? Well, if you go out in a spacesuit, you only have 4.2 pounds per square inch of pressure. But in the shuttle, we can't go below 10.2 pounds per square inch of pressure, or else we get into structural problems. And we're 14.7 here. There's more of using his computer. And see how he's holding on to his drink? Anyway, so you have to pre-breathe so you don't get the bends. So you don't have nitrogen bubbles coming out of your joints. So that's why all the work is done with pre-breathing. Here's Ron Grady. He was the pilot on the mission, and he's an Air Force test pilot. Really good today. And there I am taking pictures of the Earth, which I did a lot because I'm interested in our science. And this is the top of thunderstorms. We had a camcorder on board, and I was documenting. We were seeing, if you can see colors here, look very carefully. Right there, see the colors? That had been reported by some pilots, but they didn't really, because they were looking at it like this, they didn't say too much because, they thought, oh man, people are going to think I'm nuts. But if you're up on top of thunderstorms, you can see lots of colors. And so we were reporting that to try to document it. And sure enough, they started looking for it with other spacecraft and they could see it. So this is what irrigation, circular irrigation areas that you see on the ground from airplanes when you're flying. That's what they look like from a low Earth orbit. And they're really interesting. This is in Saudi Arabia. They're pumping really ancient water there to grow a little bit of alfalfa and stuff. So this is Baja, California, going down the peninsula. And you can see some sunglint there. You can see a lot of oceanography features in sunglint. And we work with oceanographers from the Navy on things like that. Here's Mark Lee taking pictures. Again, we just take. And the shuttle is usually down with a payload bay towards the Earth for thermal protection, so it doesn't get too hot or too cold. So that's why we usually fly with the payload bay towards the planet. And here's Florida. Red Flash, our commander, was a Floridian, and so is Norm, was a Floridian. So we got lots of pictures of Florida. And you can see all the contrails from the jets going across the state. Mark taking some more pictures. And this is the back of the shuttle, looking out the back window. And here's the Cape with the shuttle runway right there. Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center right there. Now you can see when you're up on low Earth orbit, sometimes you have trouble stabilizing yourself because you're just floating around. Miami, Florida, and then the Keys. So cities from orbit look like big gray smudges. They aren't very pretty. So I'm afraid that Baltimore is not a very pretty sight from space, unless you like gray smudges. I mean, if you're from Baltimore, you think it's beautiful, right? So it's a beautiful gray smudge. That's right. That's right. And here are the Bahamas. And coral reefs are beautiful from space. They're just incredible. The green on the planet is vegetation. Yeah, this is just color. So we were up on orbit, and as a crew, there were 5 of us. As a crew, we decided whoever got hungry first would cook. And so I ended up cooking all the time because I was always hungry first. And we got a complaint that they had the woman doing the cooking up on orbit, and we had to send out a teleprompter note saying, no, Mary's cooking because the commander sent them, Red Flash sent them this note saying, Mary's cooking because she's the one that's always hungry. And then they were okay. So, and that's the way it is on orbit. I mean, whoever needs to get something done just gets it done. And here's Mark showing you what it's like if there's no gravity. All their gear, this is right before re-entry, so you can see all the gear. Everybody's got a bag with their gear in it for re-entry because you got to put your pressure suits back on. And he played with his food a lot. He was a rookie, so he had a marvelous time. And I just, you know, I like to run. Here I was getting my morning exercise. Why use a treadmill when you can just run around the wall? Here's Norm and Red Flash, and they got those Pepperidge Farm cookies, which, I mean, small world, they make these Pepperidge Farm cookies in Cache Valley, where I went to graduate school, so, but at the plant up here. So here they are. Norm's getting ready to do his jaws. And you really do play with your food. So here's a crew, and there's Ron, and he's an Air Force test pilot. He was a pilot on the flight. And Mark Lee, and he was an Air Force pilot, and Mark and I were the Magellan deploy guys. So Mark and I were the team that deployed Magellan. Here comes Norm. Norman and Mark Lee used to do this routine. At that point, everybody was doing you pump you up. So and here I am. It was really fun. We had a good time. You notice we wear slippers, and there's Red Flash, the commander. He's a Navy test pilot, or he was a Navy test pilot. So the one thing that happened we really didn't expect, and Mark Lee and I were the designated repairmen on the mission. We had a main computer failure. We have a number of computers. They're for redundancy, and only one of them failed. So I was really surprised when they said from the ground, we want you to change it out, because just like here, if you have a computer problem, we turned it off, turned it back on, it came up and it was running fine. So we expected them to just say, leave it. But they said, no, change it. So Mark Lee and I went to change one of our main computers, which you want to be very careful about, because you need all those working, and you want them working right, which is probably why they wanted to change this. So here I am, using a regular old torque wrench, just like you use, normally, working in this computer that we put in. It worked fine when we got the new one in, so we were ready to go home. So, and you need all those computers working right to go home. So here's Red Flash getting in his pressure suit for re-entry. We didn't wear those before the accident. We just had plain flight suits on. And it was a lot more comfortable. These really aren't that comfortable. This is looking at the top window of the shuttle. That's plasma. If you study physics, and you meet plasma physicists, and they think they're theoretical people, and then they get to talk to people that have been in space, and for us, plasma is not theoretical at all. It's something we see through the window, and it's very real. So it's sometimes with new experiences, you can move from the world of the theoretical into the practical pretty fast. Looking out the side window of the shuttle, when you're coming back in, you make big turns, because you don't want any one part of the shuttle to get too hot. Okay? Coming back in on re-entry, so you're doing these big S-turns. You burn over the coast of China, you glide across the Pacific Ocean, and we landed at Edwards Air Force Base. Okay? So you're gliding all the way across the Pacific Ocean. So you want to make sure your glide path is right. And you make a big turn at the end, coming into the runway at Eddy. Big turn. And that way, if you're too low, you can make a smaller turn. And if you're too high, you can make a larger turn and end up in the right place. Because you don't have an engine, and your glider, you got to make sure you do that. So here we are on the final descent. And this is, again, I had a great ride because I was not the flight engineer on this flight, so I got just to enjoy it. I was up on the flight deck this time. Mark Lee was downstairs, and we had. I could just sit and watch what everybody was doing and have a good time. I only had one thing to do. It was fabulous. So you don't drop the gear until right before you're going to land because it adds to drag so much. And here we are coming into Edwards Air Force Base. It was a very short flight. It was only 4 days because Magellan was so big we couldn't take anything much with us. You know, just a crystallography experiment, some of those pressure suit experiments. So it was a minimum flight, and all they let you do a minimum of 4 days because you got the pilots need to be, and the flight crew needs to be reoriented up on orbit and be okay before they can bring it back down. So 4 days is the minimum flight. So here we are. You can see that we're hardly affected at all because we've only been on orbit for 4 days. So we are holding on because they tell you to hold on so you don't fall on your face. But you can see we're sort of bouncing and having no problems at all getting off the flight. But you see we changed out of our little pressure suits and we got into regular flight suits because those pressure suits are too uncomfortable. So here we are. I'm the short one. The one that was too short to be
When you're in space like that, are you allowed to like pour out a water bottle and then drink the water?
Okay, so if you're in space, you're allowed to pour out a water bottle and drink the water. Well, there's no gravity. So what happens if you pour it?
I know, I meant like that. So could you like
so if you
drink it out of it?
The only thing that's going to bring the water out of the bottle is capillary action, and that really works if there's no gravity. So the water will come out of the bottle, but it's crawling up the container sides because of capillary action, and it'll just make a big ball on the end of the mouth of the bottle. So if you put the bottle, you don't have to pour it, just put it down. Put it up, it doesn't matter. The water will come out and make a big blob. Then you can take the blob and, you don't want a big blob, it's too messy. And all of your gear is air cooled, okay? So, you know, it'd be like, you want to be careful because it's like you don't want to pour water on your computer at home. You don't want to pour water on your computers up there either. So yeah, you're very careful about it. If you do play with fluid like that, which people do, you keep those balls small enough you can get it in your mouth.
Have you ever?
One. I'm going to take the fifth. We all play with our food. My mother would be so upset I can't talk about it. My mother taught me very well not to play with my food. Okay. Did you have a question?
How do you land? Like do you back in or?
How do you land in the shuttle? The shuttle is a glider, so it lands like a glider. So if you go to the airport and you see an airplane, the shuttle lands just like an airplane or a glider does. I mean, it's just like that. However, if you come in a commercial airliner, you're coming in like this, at about 2, 3, 4 degrees. In a shuttle, you're coming in at 17. So you really look like you're diving to the ground. So it is different. It's much steeper approach to the runway. And then right when you get to the bottom, you flare. And then you just stall out and land. So, yes, do you have a question?
How do you know what to do when something's like broken?
How do you know what to do when something's broken? That's a good question. When something's not working right, you usually, if you're home, you just fix it. But if you're in a space shuttle, you have to, if you're within radio communication, you have to call to the ground to the engineers that support whatever system that is, because you have rooms of engineers down the ground that are supporting it. So you call them up, like when the computer broke. You got a computer just failed, okay? And it just, set up a red flag and said, I'm not working well. And we work with the engineers down the ground who support the computers, and they were the ones that told us exactly what to do. So yes, you fix it, but you got a lot of help. A lot of help. Okay? Another question? Yes, sir.
Is there any difference in space for the shape of liquids between two different liquids? Is there any difference, or is it just one big gelatin?
So you're asking about, well, there would be a difference if the fluids have a different density about how they mix, okay, on the ground. But because weight doesn't matter up in space, they'll act very differently. And that's part of the experiment of what you would be doing up there. We do take chambers of different things and mix them together and watch what happens. And yeah.
I just want to know what you thought the future of astronauts were, considering the space shuttle is no longer, for like the young people who want to go
Yeah.
to
Well, the future of astronauts. Well, this is probably going to be a longer answer, but I ran the science program at NASA right before I retired. Okay. So I was on the other side of the house. So I'm one of the guys. There aren't too many of them that have worked on both sides of the house. I've worked human space flight and I've worked robotic space flight, and it's all great. I recommend it to anybody. It's all fun. The conflict between the two is not really real, and I think there's a lot of grousing between the groups because of funding, But because but they aren't really competing because they're two different things, and they do two different things. The way the civilian side of government works, the civilian side of government investment in science is very, very different than the Department of Defense investment in science. On the civilian side of government, we tend to invest in science for periods of time. We expect them to get up on their own feet, spin off into companies. Okay? This is the economic pump that was set up after World War II that's kept our economy going. Civilian investment, we get spins from the DoD side too, but that's a little harder because they can't talk about what they do. But it still happens. But that's not their focus. Their focus is defending the country. And that's how they invest. On the civilian side, we actually do think about economics, spinning off jobs and that kind of stuff. So that's why you meet so many people, so many engineers that have worked down at Goddard, and they've left Goddard and they started their own companies. And that's why there are a lot of space technology companies in Maryland. Or sometimes they take it to different places because they like to ski and stuff. So that's the way the civilian side of government works. Invest, get out of the way. Once the risk is down to the point where the private sector can take it over. Okay? So it's a risk reduction technology pump. All right? We've been investing in human spaceflight for 40, 50 years. That's actually much longer than we invest in things before we back off because the risk is down. And that's what the government's doing. Low Earth orbit we've been doing for a very long time. The civilian side of government's backing off. They're turning it over to the private sector. Private guys are working on these things right now. Okay? They're going to serve a space station. Eventually we'll get out of low Earth orbit. Then the government will continue to do with humans the high-risk stuff that's too risky for companies, which is how the civilian side of government works. So right now they're arguing about whether they want to go to an asteroid, to the moon, or to Mars. That's the roaring debate. Okay? They haven't decided yet. Previous administration decided they were going to go back to the moon. There were a lot of people that were quietly saying this is not going to work because the American public got too bored with moon back in the Apollo program. That's why they shut the Apollo program down. They had other flights planned, but people lost interest. So they're trying to decide what is the right thing to do next that will engage the public. You have to engage the people that are paying for the missions, okay? So, and then they'll go do the things that are too risky for private industry to do. And whatever that is, if it's, mining an asteroid or going to Mars, eventually, we'll buy down the risk with taxpayer funds and it'll turn over to private industry and private sector jobs. Okay, does that explain it? Sort of a long answer. Is that enough?
Thank you, Mary.